2:30 in the afternoon, June 6, 1889. That's the moment a pot of glue, heating on a stove in a cabinet shop at the corner of Front and Madison in downtown Seattle, boiled over onto wood shavings and turpentine on the floor below it. Within minutes, the shop was burning. Seattle in 1889 was, in nearly every practical sense, a wooden city, its business district built almost entirely from timber construction, packed tightly together along narrow streets. Sitting on a network of wooden sidewalks and wooden pilings driven into low, marshy tideland. It was, structurally speaking, close to the ideal fuel load for exactly the kind of fire that started that afternoon. The volunteer fire department fought it for hours, but low water pressure and the sheer density of flammable material overwhelmed every effort to contain it. By the time the fire finally stopped somewhere close to midnight, it had taken roughly 24 blocks of downtown Seattle, essentially the entire business district, reduced to smoking rubble in under 12 hours, with damage estimated at the time near $20 million, a genuinely staggering figure for a Pacific Northwest city that had only recently begun to grow into real regional importance. Remarkably, official accounts record a single confirmed death from the fire itself, a fact locals at the time treated as something close to miraculous given the scale of the destruction. That's the part of the story everyone knows. What most people don't know is what happened 15 days later in a city council chamber while the ashes were still warm, and why that decision is the actual reason there's a second, forgotten Seattle sitting directly beneath the one you can walk through today. Here's what we're told, and it's the version every underground tour in Pioneer Square leads with. The fire cleared the slate. City engineers, faced with an opportunity nobody wanted but nobody could waste, decided to fix a drainage problem that had plagued the low, swampy waterfront for years by raising the street grade well above the original ground level. Property owners rebuilt their storefronts at the old elevation because they couldn't afford to wait for the new grade to be finished. The streets rose up around them, and the original ground floors simply got left behind, sealed under sidewalks, forgotten until tour guides rediscovered them decades later. It's a good story. It's also missing almost every specific detail that makes it verifiable, which is exactly the kind of gap this investigation is built to close. Let's establish the actual paper trail. On June 21st, 1889, 15 days after the fire, the Seattle City Council passed a series of ordinances that did something far more precise than simply approve a vague plan to raise the streets. They specified, block by block, exactly how high each street would rise. In Pioneer Square, some of the lowest-lying blocks were raised by as much as 22 feet, in places closer to 30. Elsewhere across the burned district, the average rise sat around 12 feet. This wasn't an abstract goal. It was a set of named, numbered ordinances on file, specifying grade elevations, street by street, the kind of document that exists precisely so nobody has to guess later what the city actually decided. The engineering itself followed a method that sounds almost primitive by modern standards, and worked anyway. Crews built retaining walls, some of stone, some of heavy timber, along both sides of each street at the new higher grade line. Between those walls they packed fill, much of it rubble from the fire itself. Blackened brick and broken masonry shoveled directly from the ruins into the very streets that had burned. Some of it imported dirt, hauled in by the wagon load from cuts made elsewhere in the growing city. On top of that fill went new roadways, frequently built from heavy timber planking rather than paving stone, because timber was cheap, available, and fast to lay. And speed mattered enormously to a city that had just lost its entire commercial core and desperately needed to look functional again for investors and settlers watching from outside. The math behind the whole project was brutally simple. It's far easier and far cheaper to raise a street 12 feet by burying it in fill than it is to somehow lower an entire city's water table and drainage grade down to meet the street as it already existed. Seattle's original waterfront sat barely above the tide line to begin with, meaning heavy rain and high tide had always combined to flood low-lying streets and backfill sewage into the very ground people were walking on. Seattle chose the cheap direction, the same direction gravity was already pulling toward, and built up instead of down. It's worth sitting for a moment on just how much this decision reshaped the physical experience of downtown Seattle almost overnight. In the months immediately following the fire, before the regrade was anywhere close to finished, the streets of Pioneer Square existed at two different elevations simultaneously, old grade and new grade, sometimes on the very same block. Contemporary accounts describe pedestrians navigating a genuinely disorienting landscape of temporary wooden ladders bridging the gap between sidewalk levels, storefronts opening directly onto what amounted to the bottom of a shallow canyon, while the street itself rose along one side like an embankment. It wasn't chaos exactly, but it was a city visibly under construction around its own inhabitants, an entire downtown rebuilding itself at two heights at once, while daily commerce somehow continued almost without interruption in the middle of it. If a 15-day gap between catastrophe and a fully specified city ordinance is the kind of paper trail you want more of, subscribe to the Historia archive right now, because the specificity is exactly where this story stops being vague folklore and starts being something you can actually check yourself. Here's the first anomaly. And it's one almost every tour skips because it complicates a tidy narrative. The rebuilding didn't wait for the streets to finish rising. Property owners, desperate to reopen and start earning money again after losing everything in the fire, began reconstructing their storefronts at the old original ground level almost immediately, while the street-raising project outside their front doors was still years from complete in many blocks. That timing mismatch is the entire reason the underground exists at all. It wasn't a deliberate architectural choice to build below grade. It was a business owner's understandable impatience colliding with a multi-year municipal construction schedule, and the collision left storefronts sitting one full story, sometimes two, below the new sidewalk level the moment the surrounding street finally caught up to its ordinance-mandated height. For a transitional period that stretched across the better part of a decade, this actually worked in a strange improvised way that nobody had planned in advance. Pedestrians reached these newly buried storefronts using ladders at first, then proper staircases built down from the new elevated sidewalks, and business continued essentially uninterrupted, just one story lower than it used to be. Shoppers walked down into what functioned as an underground retail level, browsing stores that from the inside looked completely ordinary brick walls, transom windows, hardware store signage, everything exactly as it had been built, just increasingly cut off from daylight as more sidewalk went in above. That daylight problem produced one of the most genuinely clever pieces of Victorian-era engineering hiding in plain sight across Pioneer Square today. In 1893, the City Council passed Ordinance Number 2833, mandating a specific solution for exactly this problem. thick prism-shaped glass blocks, embedded directly into iron or steel frames and set into the new sidewalks themselves, angled precisely to refract sunlight downward in the buried storefronts and ROAs below. These vault lights, sometimes called sidewalk prisms, let a shopkeeper 1 story underground still work by natural daylight streaming down through the pavement. Pedestrians were walking across over their heads. The engineering behind each individual prism was more deliberate than it looks at a casual glance. The glass wasn't simply flat and clear. It was cast with a slightly convex or faceted lower surface, deliberately shaped to bend incoming sunlight and spread it wider across the ceiling of the space below, rather than letting it fall as a single narrow, useless shaft of light directly beneath the block. The frames themselves were set flush with the surrounding sidewalk and sealed with tar to keep rain and street runoff from dripping straight down onto merchandise in the arrowway underneath. It's an elegant solution to a problem that only existed because of a scheduling accident, glass engineered specifically to compensate for a decision nobody in 1889 had actually planned to make permanent. You can still find working examples of these vault lights today, embedded in sidewalks across Pioneer Square, easy to miss unless you're specifically looking down instead of up. Most have been paved over or replaced with solid concrete decades ago, as buildings changed hands and street maintenance crews found it simpler to fill the recessed frames than repair aging glass. But a meaningful number survive intact, protected in places where property owners or the city recognized their historical value early enough to leave them alone. Where they survive, they carry a second, entirely unplanned piece of physical evidence about how long they've actually been there. If the idea of literally walking on daylight, glass prisms embedded in a sidewalk, specifically engineered to light a buried storefront beneath your feet, is the kind of forensic architectural detail you want more of, go ahead and subscribe now, because Seattle's ordnance record is full of exactly this kind of precise, checkable engineering response to an accident nobody saw coming. Here's where the popular version of this story starts to drift from the documented one in a way worth correcting directly. Ask most Seattle Underground tours who's responsible for this buried city, and you'll frequently hear one name attached to the whole project: Reginald Heber Thomson, sometimes described in local histories as the man who flattened Seattle. Thomson is a real, extraordinarily consequential figure in the city's engineering history. But he did not become Seattle's city engineer until 1892, 3 years after the fire and the original regrade ordinances were already on the books. And his signature achievement, the massive regrades that literally sluiced entire hills into Elliott Bay using high-pressure water cannons, didn't begin until 1898, starting with First Avenue from Pike Street to Denny Way, an entirely separate, far larger and far later project than the Pioneer Square street raising that created the underground. Popular retellings collapse these two things into one continuous story because Thomson's later work was so dramatic and so well documented that his name became shorthand for essentially all of Seattle's regrading history. But the ordinances that actually buried the storefronts of Pioneer Square were passed and largely executed before Thomson ever held the office that made him famous. Getting this detail right isn't a minor footnote. It's the difference between crediting one visionary engineer with a unified master plan and understanding what actually happened. A city council reacting fast to an emergency years before the man who'd later reshape entire hillsides even took the job. The underground didn't stay open forever, And here's where the second, more interesting discrepancy in the popular story shows up. Ask a tour guide why the underground finally closed to the public, and you'll often hear a dramatic version involving repeated fatal accidents, pedestrians and shoppers falling through neglected or vandalized vault lights and sidewalk openings into the darkness below, sometimes with a specific casualty count attached to make the danger concrete. That kind of accident almost certainly did happen, at least occasionally, given how many open shafts, ladders, and imperfectly maintained sidewalk openings existed across the underground network for the better part of 2 decades. But the precise casualty figures that circulate in popular retellings today are difficult to verify against a single consistent, cited primary source, and different tellings of the story report different numbers, which is usually a sign that a specific dramatic detail has drifted from documented fact into a form more useful for storytelling than for citation. What the actual municipal record from 1907 shows is a different official justification entirely. That year, the city condemned and ordered the closure of the underground network to public access, and the reason on record wasn't primarily pedestrian safety from falls at all. It was public health, specifically fear of bubonic plague. The early 20th century saw genuine, well-documented plague outbreaks moving through West Coast port cities, San Francisco most famously, carried by fleas living on rats, and Seattle's damp, poorly ventilated, increasingly neglected underground spaces, full of stagnant water and abandoned storefronts, were exactly the kind of environment public health officials of the era were terrified could harbor exactly that kind of infestation. The order to seal the underground from public use in 1907 reads, in the surviving record, as a public health measure aimed at a citywide epidemic fear, not primarily a response to a specific, countable sequence of accidental deaths. That doesn't mean nobody was ever hurt falling through a vault light. It means the popular version has quietly swapped a harder-to-verify, more dramatic cause for the one the actual ordnance record supports. If watching a popular legend's exact casualty count get replaced by what the 1907 ordnance record actually says is the kind of correction you want more of, subscribe to Historia Archive, because this channel exists specifically for the moment where the tour guide version and the paper trail stop agreeing. Once the underground was condemned, something happened that, once you understand Chicago's version of this same story, starts to feel entirely predictable. The city didn't excavate it, removing the fill, the retaining walls, and the buried storefronts beneath a fully rebuilt, functioning downtown would have been extraordinarily expensive and disruptive, tearing up streets, utilities, and building foundations that had been in continuous use for nearly 2 decades by that point. Sealing it in place, simply cutting off public access and letting the space sit empty and forgotten below the modern street, cost almost nothing by comparison. So that's what happened. Storefronts that had been fully operational businesses just years earlier were locked, some of them essentially abandoned mid-use, their transom windows, hardware, and signage left exactly as they were on the day the doors closed. And the city moved on, one story above, without a second thought for what was sitting directly beneath its own sidewalks. That's why, when researchers and eventually tour operators began systematically exploring these spaces decades later, they found something remarkably close to a sealed time capsule rather than an empty basement. Original brick facades, intact transom windows, in several documented locations, the original signage for hardware stores and other businesses, faded but legible, exactly where it had hung the day the lights went out for the last time. The purple-tinted glass you can still see in some of Seattle's surviving vault lights today isn't decorative. It's a chemical accident of history. And understanding why it happened tells you something real about how old the glass in front of you actually is. Manganese oxide was added to glass formulas in this period as what glassmakers called a decolorizer, a chemical meant to counteract the faint greenish tint that naturally occurs in glass made with ordinary sand, producing a clearer, more transparent finished product. What nobody manufacturing that glass in the 1890s and early 1900s understood was that manganese reacts slowly with ultraviolet light over very long timescales, gradually shifting from clear to a soft, unmistakable violet or lavender color as the decades pass. It's essentially a very slow chemical clock built into the glass itself. Glass containing manganese and exposed to consistent sunlight for a century or more turns purple. Glass made after roughly the First World War. Once manufacturers largely switched to different decolorizing agents because manganese supply chains were disrupted, does not do this at all, no matter how long it sits in the sun. Which means every panel of genuinely purple vault light glass still sitting in a Seattle sidewalk today is by its own chemistry, telling you it predates that manufacturing shift, an accidental authentication mark that nobody who installed the glass ever intended to build in, verified not by a historian's opinion, but by simple, checkable photochemistry. So here's the actual answer to the question this investigation opened with. The one about why a fire that could have simply been rebuilt on its original footprint instead became the pretext for entombing an entire commercial district. It wasn't a grand, deliberate plan to bury anything. It was a genuine drainage and public health problem the city had wanted to solve for years, finally made politically and financially possible by a disaster that leveled the obstacles standing in the way, combined with property owners who understandably couldn't wait years for the streets to catch up before reopening their businesses. The gap between those two timelines, ordnance and rebuilding, is the entire underground. Nobody voted to create a hidden city. A 15-day-old ordinance and a merchant's understandable impatience did that on their own, and the result has been sitting quietly under Pioneer Square for well over a century, waiting for anyone curious enough to check the actual date on the paperwork. What makes Seattle's version of this story distinct from a simple case of bad timing is how visible the evidence still is, more than a century later, to anyone willing to look down instead of straight ahead. Chicago's buried flaws mostly hide behind ordinary brick facades in residential neighborhoods, indistinguishable at a glance from an unusually built house unless you know exactly what you're looking for. Seattle's buried storefronts sit in an entire connected network, walkable, mapped, and in places formerly preserved, precisely because the scale of the burial was so large and so concentrated in a single, valuable commercial district that demolishing it was never seriously worth the cost, then or now. The accident of timing that created the underground in 1889 became, by simple economic inertia, the reason it still exists largely intact today. Nobody protected it out of sentiment for the first several decades. It survived because getting rid of it was never quite worth the trouble, the exact same calculation that decided its fate in the first place. Thank you for watching. If you've ever walked through Pioneer Square without realizing there's a second sidewalk sitting directly beneath the one under your feet, you're not alone. Most people who live in Seattle don't know it either. Let me know in the comments if you've been down into the underground yourself. And what surprised you most about what's actually still down there? I'll see you in the next investigation.